You ever look at a company's stock price and just wonder, what's really going on under the hood? Well, a huge piece of that puzzle is something called earnings per share, or EPS. Now, on the surface, it looks like a simple number. But trust me, when you dig a little deeper, it tells a fascinating story about a company's health right now and its potential for the future.
So let's start with a big question. How do you actually measure a company's success? I mean, you could just look at its total profit, right? But that doesn't really tell you much. Think about it. A giant corporation making $1 million isn't nearly as impressive as a tiny startup making that same million. We need a better way to compare them. We need to compare apples to apples.
And that's exactly where earnings per share comes into the picture. The official accounting standard, IAS 33, was literally designed with one goal in mind, to make it easier to compare different companies. It's not just some random number. It's a tool, a common language that helps investors judge performance on a level playing field.
So here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we're going to tackle the why. Why EPS even matters. Then, we'll get into the simple, basic calculation. After that, things get interesting. We'll dive into the what-if scenarios that accountants worry about. That's going to lead us straight into the idea of dilution. And finally, we'll see the complete story that basic and diluted EPS tell together.
All right, let's jump in. Section 1. Why do we even need this thing called EPS? Well, think of it as the universal yardstick for a company's profitability. You see, companies can get a little, creative with how they calculate their earnings. But EPS brings some order to the chaos by standardizing the other half of the equation, the per share part. By focusing on how much profit belongs to each individual share, we get a much clearer and way more comparable picture of how profitable a company truly is, no matter its size. And this, right here, is the crucial point. The real tricky part, the whole focus of the accounting standard, isn't actually the profit number on top, the numerator. Nope. It's the bottom number, the denominator, the number of shares. Getting that number right is what this is all about, because, as you're about to see, it's not always as simple as it sounds. Okay, let's move on to the basic calculation. And to make this really easy to grasp, I want you to imagine a company's total profit as one giant, delicious pizza. Basic EPS is just our way of figuring out how big of a slice each shareholder gets. Simple as that. At its core, the formula is really pretty simple. You take the company's net earnings, that's our pizza, and you just divide it by the weighted average number of shares. In other words, how many people are we splitting this pizza with?
Now, you probably noticed that phrase, weighted average. We don't just pick the number of shares on a random day. Why? Well, because that number is always changing. Companies are constantly issuing new shares or buying back old ones. So to get a fair picture, accountants use a time-weighted average that reflects the capital the company had to work with throughout the entire year. It's just more accurate.
So, what kind of things can actually change that share count? All sorts of stuff. A company might issue new shares to raise cash, or maybe it'll convert some of its debt into stock. It could issue shares to buy another company, or even to pay its employees or contractors. Every one of these events changes the denominator. It changes the number of slices our pizza gets cut into.
Okay, so we've sliced up the pizza for everyone who's currently at the party. But what if more guests are on their way? What if some people have invitations but they haven't shown up yet? This is where we get into the what-if scenario. And this is where EPS starts to get really interesting.
The official fancy term for these potential new guests is a potential ordinary share. The accounting rulebook basically defines this as any contract that could turn into a regular share down the road. So just think of it as someone holding an invitation to the pizza party who hasn't walked through the door yet.
So what do these potential shares look like in the real world? Well, common examples are things like convertible debt that can be swapped for stock, or stock options that are given to employees. It could even be shares that will only get issued if the company hits certain performance goals. They're all just waiting in the wings.
And this brings us to a super important concept, dilution. Right, back to our pizza party. If all those people holding invitations suddenly decide to show up, what happens? Exactly. Everybody's slice gets smaller. That, my friends, is dilution.
This really gets to the heart of that worst-case scenario thinking that accountants love. The official definition of dilution is the drop in earnings per share that would happen if we assume all those potential shares suddenly became real. It's a purposefully conservative way to look at a company's profitability.
So now we've got two different views of the company. You have basic EPS, which is like a snapshot of today's reality. It tells you what actually happened, based on the shares that really existed. But then you have diluted EPS, and that's more like a forecast of a potential future. It's a conservative peek at what might happen if every possible claim on the company's profits came true.
To put it as simply as possible, diluted EPS answers one crucial question for any investor. If everyone with an invitation crashes this party, what happens to my slice of the pizza? It's basically a stress test for the true earnings power of your shares.
Okay, let's bring it all home. What's the real story that these two numbers, basic and diluted EPS, are trying to tell an investor? What's the big takeaway from all this?
Let's just break it down side by side. Basic EPS is all about historical fact. It uses only the actual existing shares to show you the current profitability. Diluted EPS, on the other hand, is all about a future possibility. It throws all those potential shares into the pot to give you that conservative, worst-case view. Now, if you remember only one thing today, make it this. When you see a company's diluted EPS is lower than its basic EPS, that's a signal. It's a bright, flashing light telling you that there are potential new shares out there that can shrink your claim on the company's profits. And the bigger that gap between the two numbers, the more your slice of that pizza is at risk.
So you see, a company's earnings per share really does tell a story. You can think of basic EPS as the last chapter. It tells you how things wrapped up for the year. But diluted EPS? That's the epilogue. It gives you a little hint of what might come next. A smart investor always reads both. The real question is, which one are you paying more attention to?